Rome. The name alone conjures images of marble columns, powerful legions, and an empire that ruled the known world for centuries. But here's something they don't teach you in history class. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. Rome fell because it went broke, completely, catastrophically broke. And the reason? They spent 75% of their entire budget on their military. Let that sink in. 3/4 of every coin collected in taxes went to feed, equip, and pay soldiers. It was financial suicide in slow motion. And today, we're going to trace exactly how the mightiest empire in human history spent itself into oblivion. Let's start at the beginning, when Rome actually had its act together. Picture the year 27 BC. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, has just consolidated power after decades of civil war. The empire stretches from the foggy cliffs of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. Millions of people, hundreds of cities, and the most sophisticated economy the ancient world had ever seen. Augustus understood something crucial that his successors would forget. An empire is only as strong as its treasury. The Roman financial system was, for its time, a masterpiece. At its core was the denarius, a silver coin that became the backbone of Mediterranean trade. When Augustus took power, a denarius contained about 95% pure silver. It was real money, backed by real metal, and people trusted it. From the markets of Rome to the trading posts of Syria, merchants accepted the denarius without question. This wasn't just convenient, it was the glue that held a massive multicultural empire together. Augustus also reformed the tax system. Rome collected revenue through several channels. There was the tributum, a land tax based on property ownership. There was a poll tax, levied on most citizens based on census data. And there were customs duties on goods moving through the empire's ports and borders. The system was relatively efficient, at least by ancient standards. Tax collectors, despite their terrible reputation, actually kept records, filed reports, and funneled money back to the central treasury. For the first time in Roman history, someone was actually tracking where the money came from and where it went. Military spending under Augustus was significant but controlled. The legions numbered around 300,000 men scattered across the empire's frontiers. Each legionary earned 900 sesterces per year, roughly equivalent to a laborer's annual wage. It was enough to live on, but nobody was getting rich. After 25 years of service, soldiers received either a plot of land or a cash bonus, but these pensions were funded through a special military treasury that Augustus established specifically for this purpose. The system was sustainable, barely. Here's what made Augustus a financial genius. He understood balance. Yes, the military consumed a large chunk of the budget, but there was still money left over for roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and the grain dole that fed Rome's urban poor. The empire wasn't just maintaining itself, it was investing in infrastructure that would generate more wealth. Roads facilitated trade, aqueducts supported growing cities, public works employed thousands. The money circulated through the economy instead of just disappearing into military black holes. But Augustus was an exception. After he died in 14 AD, the careful balance he'd established began to crack. Some of his successors tried to maintain fiscal discipline, others didn't even pretend to care. Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, is a perfect example of what happens when an emperor treats the treasury like a personal piggy bank. Nero spent staggering sums on his Golden House, a massive palace complex that sprawled across central Rome. He funded elaborate festivals, gladiatorial games, and artistic performances. When the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city in 64 AD, Nero spent even more on reconstruction. Where did the money come from? Nowhere good. Nero started confiscating property from wealthy Romans, often on trumped-up charges of treason. He debased the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius to stretch the money supply. And he borrowed, heavily. This established a dangerous pattern. Future emperors inherited not just power, but debt, and rather than cut spending, they borrowed more, debased the currency further, and kicked the problem down the road. It's easy to criticize them from 2,000 years in the future, but put yourself in their position. An emperor's survival depended on keeping several key groups happy: the Senate, the urban poor of Rome, the provincial governors, and above all, the army. cut military spending and you risked mutiny, cut the grain dole and you risked riots in the streets, raise taxes too high and you risked rebellion in the provinces. Every emperor faced the same impossible math, and almost all of them chose short-term stability over long-term sustainability.
By the 2nd century AD, the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. The empire had stopped expanding. This mattered more than you might think. For centuries, Roman military campaigns had been self-funding. Conquest brought plunder, tribute, and new lands to tax. The Gallic Wars under Julius Caesar, for instance, were enormously profitable. But by the time of Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD, Rome had reached its maximum sustainable size. There were no more rich kingdoms to conquer nearby, and the frontiers had to be actively defended against increasingly organized enemies. The Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube weren't going away. The Parthian Empire in the east was a genuine military rival. Defending the borders required permanent garrisons, constant patrols, and frequent, expensive military expeditions. The numbers tell the story. By the mid-2nd century, military spending consumed somewhere between 60 and 75% of imperial revenue, depending on which historian you ask. Let me put that in perspective. Imagine your household budget. Now imagine spending 3/4 of your income just on security systems, locks, and guards. You'd have almost nothing left for food, maintenance, savings, or investment. That's where Rome was. The empire was pouring money into the military just to maintain the status quo, with almost nothing left over for everything else. And it was about to get worse. In 193 AD, Emperor Pertinax was assassinated after a reign of just 87 days. What followed was literally an auction. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, announced they would sell the throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won with a bid of 25,000 sesterces per soldier. He ruled for 66 days before being executed by his successor, Septimius Severus. Severus, a capable military commander, understood the lesson. Military loyalty was for sale, and the price kept going up. Severus nearly doubled soldiers' pay. He had to. The army had just proven it would literally kill emperors who didn't pay enough. But here's the problem. Doubling military salaries doesn't double your revenue. The money had to come from somewhere, and there weren't a lot of options. Severus raised taxes, confiscated more property from his political enemies, and yes, debased the currency. On his deathbed in 211 AD, Severus supposedly gave his sons one piece of advice: enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. It was a frank admission that the empire had become a protection racket. Rome was now paying its own army not to overthrow the government. The 3rd century was when everything fell apart. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had at least 26 legitimate emperors and countless others who claimed the title but didn't last long enough to matter. This period, called the crisis of the 3rd century, was financial chaos. Emperors came and went so quickly they barely had time to mint coins with their faces on them before being murdered by the next guy in line. Each new emperor needed to buy military loyalty, which meant bonuses, pay raises, and donatives. The treasury couldn't keep up, so they printed money. Well, not printed exactly. They debased the coinage. Remember that denarius that was 95% silver under Augustus? By 200 AD, it was down to about 50% silver. By 270 AD, the silver content had plummeted to less than 5%. The silver coins were basically bronze with a thin silver wash that would rub off after a few transactions. The government was producing counterfeit versions of its own currency. The economic effects were devastating. When you flood the market with fake money, people aren't stupid. They figure it out quickly. Merchants started demanding more coins for the same goods because they knew the coins were worthless. This sparked inflation on a scale the ancient world had never seen. Between 200 and 300 AD, prices increased by more than 1,000%. Read that again, 1,000% inflation in a single century. If a loaf of bread cost 1 denarius in 200 AD, it cost more than 10 denarii by 300 AD. Meanwhile, soldiers' salaries, even though they'd been doubled or tripled in nominal terms, couldn't keep pace with rising prices. The very soldiers Rome was trying to keep happy were being economically squeezed despite their pay raises. Emperor Diocletian, who took power in 284 AD, tried to fix the problem with the most Roman solution imaginable: make a law against it. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, which literally listed legal maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to shoe repairs to prostitution. Violators faced the death penalty. It failed spectacularly. You cannot legislate away the effects of inflation caused by currency debasement. What actually happened was predictable. Merchants stopped openly selling goods at the legal prices. Black markets flourished. Farmers hoarded grain rather than sell it at artificially low prices. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years.
By this point, trust in Roman currency had completely collapsed. Provincial governors started collecting taxes in goods rather than coins, because the coins were worthless. Soldiers demanded payment in gold, food, or land instead of debased silver. International merchants stopped accepting denarii. The sophisticated monetary economy that had unified the Mediterranean world for 3 centuries was reverting to barter in many places. Rome's financial system, the foundation of its power, had disintegrated. The military spending that caused all this didn't just drain the treasury, it starved every other part of the government. Infrastructure crumbled. Roads that had once connected the empire fell into disrepair. Aqueducts leaked or broke. Public buildings decayed. The postal system, which had allowed rapid communication across vast distances, became unreliable. Tax collection became less efficient, which meant less revenue, which meant more currency debasement, which meant more inflation. It was a death spiral. The social effects were just as destructive. The middle class, small farmers, and urban workers were crushed. Their savings evaporated as inflation destroyed the value of money. The tax burden fell increasingly on those least able to pay, since the wealthy had ways to avoid or evade taxation. Many farmers simply abandoned their lands rather than work them at a loss. This led to declining agricultural production, which meant food shortages, which meant higher prices, which made everything worse. Social mobility, one of the things that had made Rome dynamic and resilient, essentially disappeared. Leadership failures compounded the crisis. Some emperors were incompetent, some were insane. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 AD, spent more time fighting as a gladiator in the arena than governing. He renamed Rome after himself, declared himself a god, and sold political offices to fund his lifestyle. Caracalla, who ruled from 211 to 217 AD, was so paranoid he massacred thousands of Alexandrians because he thought they'd made fun of him. These weren't the careful stewards of public finances the empire desperately needed. They were egomaniacs and paranoids with access to the treasury. By the 4th century, Rome had split into eastern and western halves, partly because the empire had become too large and too broke to govern as a single unit. The Western Roman Empire, centered on Rome itself, was a shadow of its former glory. It lurched from crisis to crisis, propped up by dramatic mercenaries who eventually decided they'd rather rule than serve. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for half a millennium was over. Here's what's fascinating and terrifying about Rome's collapse. It was preventable. At multiple points, different emperors could have made different choices. They could have reduced military commitments. They could have reformed the tax system to be more efficient and less corrupt. They could have maintained the currency's value. They could have invested in economic growth instead of just military consumption. But they didn't. They chose short-term political survival over long-term fiscal health, again and again, until there was nothing left to save. The lessons for us today are uncomfortably clear. Modern nations face similar temptations. Military spending is politically popular and creates powerful constituencies who resist cuts. Deficit spending lets politicians deliver benefits now and push costs onto future generations. Currency manipulation through monetary policy can mask underlying economic problems. And leadership matters. A succession of short-sighted, self-interested leaders can drive even a prosperous nation into crisis. Rome spent 75% of its budget on its military, and it destroyed the empire from within. Not immediately, not obviously, but steadily, year after year, decade after decade, until the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known simply ran out of money and collapsed under its own weight. The barbarians who sacked Rome in 410 and 455 AD didn't conquer a mighty empire. They scavenged the corpse of one that had already bled itself dry. The Roman Empire fell not because its enemies were too strong, but because it was too weak. And it was weak because it was broke, because it had spent itself into oblivion pursuing military dominance at the expense of everything else, because it had debased its currency, borrowed recklessly, taxed destructively, and refused to make hard choices until it was too late. Rome's collapse was financial before it was military. The swords that ended the Western Empire were merely finishing a job that centuries of fiscal mismanagement had already begun. That's the real story of Rome. Not a tale of barbarian invasions or moral decay, but a case study in how even the most powerful state in the world can destroy itself through simple arithmetic. Spend more than you earn for long enough, and eventually the bill comes due. Rome learned that lesson the hard way. The question is, will we?